Thank you all for coming down tonight. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, through the generous support of the Knight Foundation. So a note to our internet audience watching at home. If you're interested in tonight's book, we can get a copy shipped to you wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Just call the number on your screen. So this evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. Robert Kurson and his new book, Pirate Hunters, Treasure, Obsession, and the Search for a Legendary Pirate Ship. Mr. Kurson began his career as an attorney, graduating from Harvard Law School, before becoming a journalist. He has written for the Chicago Sun-Times, Chicago Magazine, and Esquire, as well as having his work appear in Rolling Stone, the New York Times Magazine, and other publications. He is also the author of the previous works Shadow Divers and Crashing Through. In this book, Mr. Kurson brings us the story of John Chatterton and John Matera, who are willing to risk everything to find the wreck of the Golden Fleece, the ship of the infamous pirate Joseph Bannister. To do so, they must travel the globe in search of historic documents and accounts of the great pirates' exploits, face down dangerous rivals, battle the tides of nations and governments and experts. But it's only when they learn to think and act like pirates that they become able to go where no pirate hunters have gone before. Here to tell us more about it, please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Robert Kurson.
Hello, everybody. It's so kind of you to come out tonight. I'm from Chicago, so I made the mistake of running over here after dinner, so I apologize for overheating a bit. We don't worry about that so much in Chicago. About 3.5 years ago, I was working in my home office in Chicago, and the phone rang. And it was a very busy time of year, holidays and snowing outside. And I grabbed the phone, and the person on the other end of the line didn't introduce himself. He didn't say hello. All he said was, "If you like pirates, meet me in New Jersey." So I don't know how many of you have ever received a call like that. This was the first of my career. But I knew who it was just by the tone of the voice. I didn't even have to hear words. It was John Chatterton, who was one of the two subjects of my first book, Shadow Divers, which is a true story of two recreational scuba divers who, one day in 1991, found a World War II German U-boat sunk in 230 feet of water off the coast of New Jersey. And it was a story of their 6-year quest, their obsession to solve the mystery of which U-boat it was, who was inside, what it was doing in New Jersey, and how it had met its end. So John Chatterton said, "Come to New Jersey, hear about pirates." And this was about the worst possible time for me to make a trip to New Jersey. As I said, it was bad weather outside, freezing, holidays, and I had my own work to do. But if there's one thing I'd learned from John Chatterton working with him years before this, it was that in life, if there's a window to go, even if it's a very small window, you go. And so I didn't ask any more questions. I packed my bags, got in my car, got on I-94 and headed east to New Jersey. About 11 or 12 hours later, I arrived and went into Scotty's Steakhouse. That was actually the scene of some of the meetings in Shadow Divers. And there was John Chatterton, looking every bit as fit and trim as I remember. He looked in terrific shape. And he was sitting there with another fellow, someone I'd seen once before, a guy named John Matera, a big, strong, powerful guy. And I remember John Matera. I met him once in Chicago at a dive show. And I particularly remembered him, not just for the power of his build, but for the power of his generosity as well. He picked up a 4-figure dinner tab at Gibson's Steakhouse in Chicago. So I always remembered that act of kindness. So there the two of them were sitting, and I asked them, how have you been and what's been happening? And they each told me, in their own way, that life had been very good to them. But a few years before this, they arrived at a crossroads. Now, they hadn't seen each other for 25 years. They knew each other kind of in passing. But each separately had found himself at a crossroads in life. They'd done a lot, had some incredible adventures. But now, for Chatterton, who was approaching 60, and Matera approaching 50, they found that there might not be anything left to do. Anything thrilling, at least. Anything worth doing. And that seemed to suit the people they knew just fine. I mean, sensible people that each man knew gave them very sound advice at this point. You know, you've been taking a lot of risks. They're both deep water shipwreck divers, had both seen people die in front of them on shipwrecks. Chatterton 9 or 10 times himself alone. So people gave them very sound advice. It's time to hang it up. It's time to come out of the water and do something reasonable. And they told me what some of the suggestions were. Accountants and lawyers and others recommended that they buy a laundromat or invest in apartment buildings and keep ledgers on the rent. And I remember one specific piece of advice very distinctly. John Chatterton was advised to buy a Dunkin' Donuts franchise. Now, if you know anything about John Chatterton, you know, and I mean this literally, he would rather die than retire and own a donut franchise. But the question remained, what do you do now, especially for a guy like John Chatterton, when it seems you've done it all and you have appetites like he does and you want to see the world and challenge the world? What does a person do? Well, John Chatterton at this point in his life, and this would have been around 2006 or 2007, didn't have a good answer for that. Neither did John Matera. So they were both at this crossroads. John Matera had a place in the Dominican Republic, and he was taking some scuba divers on dive charters. And he invited John Chatterton, who he hadn't seen for about 25 years, to come be the guest speaker at one of these dive charters. Excuse me. And Chatterton showed up for this, and the two got to talking. And they reviewed their situation in life. They acknowledged the crossroads they were at. And then John Matera told Chatterton something very interesting. And that's that he'd been interested in history since about the age of 8. That Matera had had a rough and tumble life, a very interesting life, one that might have gone either way. But history had always called him, especially historical shipwrecks. And he'd been doing some research in the archives around the world. He'd visited rare map dealers and rare book dealers. He'd gone to libraries all over the place. He'd opened volumes that some of which hadn't been touched for 300 years. And Matera had determined that if a person put his mind into it, and especially his heart into it, he could find a Spanish galleon in the Dominican Republic, a lost Spanish treasure ship. There were still some there sunk and unfound, and that if a person had the right heart and the right commitment, he could find one, and it would be loaded with treasure. But even better than treasure, it would be loaded with history. Maybe a person could even find the oldest shipwreck ever lost in the Americas. Well, John Chatterton's eyes lit up at that. A treasure ship. That could be the perfect next thing to do. It would be wonderful, could make history, could make them very rich. And the adventure of it all, more than anything, the adventure of it all, it sounded wonderful. So there, over breakfast, the two men shook hands and they pledged everything to each other. Their money, their time, their commitment. They would do everything it took and anything it took to research and then find a lost Spanish galleon, a treasure ship in the Dominican Republic. So for 2 years, they told me, they invested in this dream. They bought hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, studied the technology, got a crew together, one of whom is sitting right here in the front row, Howard Ehrenberg. They had a plan, and they rehearsed, and they went out practicing, and they found shipwrecks. They found practice shipwrecks. They got better and better at using their equipment until around 2008, they were ready to go, ready to do this. Just about on the eve of their launch for a lost Spanish galleon called the San Bartolome, they had a discussion with an American treasure hunter, a legend in the business, a man named Tracy Bowden, who had found not one, but 3 Spanish galleons of his own. He had become a legend in the business. There were 2 National Geographic profiles written about Bowden and his amazing discoveries, one of which I think remains one of the longest pieces the magazine ever did. He was known throughout the world as a great treasure hunter. But he told Chatterton and Matera that there was one thing that he wanted to find that he hadn't yet found in his career, something very, very special, something more rare than you might find anywhere in the world underwater, or maybe anywhere in the world, period. And that was a pirate ship, a Golden Age pirate ship. Now, Chatterton and Matera were men of the sea, and they were men of the history books. They didn't need to have it explained to them how rare pirate ships were to discover. To this point, in about 2008 or 2007, only one Golden Age pirate ship had ever been found and positively identified, a ship called the Whydah, which was found by an explorer named Barry Clifford off the coast of Cape Cod. But even greater then the discovery of the Witta, this pirate ship, was the proof of its identity. That part was virtually impossible. But Clifford got very, very lucky. The Witta still had a bell on it. It was recently stolen, so the proof of its identity was complete. Otherwise, a person might stumble across a shipwreck that they hoped would be a pirate ship, maybe that they were audacious enough to call a pirate ship, but it would be very unlikely that the person could prove it. Pirate ships often were stolen merchant ships. They looked very much the same. They carried very much the same weapons and artifacts and cargoes. It would be very difficult to prove. But Tracy Bowden had good news for Chatterton and Matera, and that was that the pirate ship he was looking for and had thought about for a very long time, the Golden Fleece, had sunk on the north coast of the Dominican Republic in a bay called Samana Bay. And he had a very good idea about the island at which the wreck could be found. So that sounded very exciting to Chatterton and Matera, a Golden Age pirate ship, the rarest thing you could find underwater and maybe in all the world. And even though they pledged to go find a Spanish galleon and not to get off track, this was something they could not turn their backs on. This was the true chance to make the rarest kind of history. So with that, they made an agreement with Tracy Bowden that they would go after the Golden Fleece. And it was all good news because Chatterton and Matera knew the island where the wreck was supposed to lie. It was a small island called Cayo Levantado in Samana Bay, a very small island, maybe a half-mile across and a quarter-mile up and down. It would be easy using their equipment that they'd mastered the last few years, a side-scan sonar and magnetometers. It would be a matter of weeks to find it. So it was all wonderful. This was already the beginning of the dream they'd had when they shook hands over breakfast that day. So I couldn't wait to hear what happened next. But the guys were closing Scotty's that night. They said, it's time to leave. And we walked out into the parking lot. It was freezing. And I said, well, tell me the rest of the story. What happened? And Chatterton and Matera said, well, we can't really tell you the rest of the story here. And I said, all right, well, let's find a place that's still open. And they said, no, we mean you can't hear it here in New Jersey or even in the United States. To really understand what happened next, to understand our journey, you have to come to the Dominican Republic. You really have to come to Samana Bay and see it for yourself. Well, I'd come all the way to New Jersey by now, and I figured I'm halfway there already. Let's do it. So I booked a flight for a couple weeks later, and there I arrived in the Dominican Republic. I'd never been there. I'd never really thought much about it. But when I arrived, I was picked up by an armed guard in a truck, and I thought we were going to take the 5-hour journey north to Samana Bay. But instead, the driver took me to the Ministry of Culture's Subaquatico department. And there, other armed guards opened the gate, and we drove in, and there was a small kind of warehouse there. And they opened the door to the warehouse, and we walked in. I had no idea why we were there. But the minute the door opened and I walked in, I knew why they'd brought me here. There before me was treasure. I'd never seen treasure in my life, but instantly I knew what I was looking at. On one table was a pile of silver coins, pieces of 8. On another was gold chains and gold coins. On another still artifacts like dice carved of bone with sharp pointy edges to prevent them from toppling over in wavy seas. There were Madeira wine bottles, olive jars, all kinds of navigational instruments, an astrolabe, one of the rarest kind of things you could find. And there in a cement container off to the side, I walked over, and someone told me in there is one of Columbus's anchors. And it was unprotected by lasers or plexiglass or guards. It was just there, open. And I reached my hand and very, very lightly touched Columbus's anchor. And centuries disappeared with the contact. It was an experience that would have been impossible here in the States, but it was direct contact with Christopher Columbus himself. This was a magical place. So Chatterton and Matera waved me over and they said, come over here, touch the treasure. So I walked over to the table that had the silver on it. They said, touch it. And I put my pointer finger out and I reached down and touched it very lightly. Bing! I said, no, that's not how you touch treasure. Touch it. And I knew what that meant. So I put my hands like this and scooped under and lifted it up. And as the silver fell through my hands, I knew what I was holding. It fell in a different way than anything I'd ever held before. It fell heavier. And it didn't just clank down onto the table. It chimed. It was musical as it fell through my fingers. And it made a sound I'd never heard before, but somehow had known my whole life. This was the sound of treasure. This was the sound that had spoken to the pirates. And immediately I knew why the pirates had gone, why the treasure ships had gone. There was nothing in the world I'd ever experienced like touching real treasure. Now that I'd had the experience, the guy said, back in the truck, let's go. And we did begin our trip to Samana Bay, about 5 hours to the north. Every 20 or 30 miles, the road got rougher, and we seemed to go backwards in time. Wild animals started to dart out on the street. Along the way, the guys would say, oh, we once saw a dead body laying over there. There were people with machetes in the street just walking around. By the time we got to Samana, it really seemed like we had traveled through a time machine. And they took me to the bay area and said, we need to get in the boat. And they put me in a boat in Samana Bay and pointed toward the island, Cayo Levantado, where the Golden Fleece was supposed to have sunk. We got there about 20 minutes later, and this island, I hope you don't think I'm exaggerating, it was about the most beautiful place you could ever see on Earth. It actually was used by Bacardi rum for years in their ads as a kind of depiction of paradise on Earth. It really was that beautiful. You know, the Bacardi could have picked anywhere to use. They picked this one small island. It was every bit as beautiful as you might imagine. And it was every bit as small as the guys had told me. And they said, the Golden Fleece, according to history, sank at this island while it was on the careen. I didn't even know what the careen meant, and they explained to me that old wooden ships had to be beached and turned on their side and have their hulls scrubbed so that barnacles and other growths didn't eat away at the hull and slow it down. So that Bannister's ship was careening. The Royal Navy had cornered him while he was on the careen. He was one of the most wanted men in the Caribbean at the time. And the Royal Navy did battle with Bannister and defeated him and sunk his ship. And it was supposed to be at Cayo Levantado. And then they started to show me the island, and they said, well, look, there's no beaches on 2 of the 4 ends of this island. Let us take you to one that does have a beach. And they took me, and they said, now, if you were a good pirate, would you careen your ship here if you were the most wanted man in the Caribbean? And I looked around, and I could see that the area was open to the Atlantic. You could be seen from anywhere there. So I said, well, I don't know much about captaining a ship, but I don't think I'd hide here. They said, we wouldn't either. Let us take you to the best beach. They took me around to the western end of Cayo Levantado, gorgeous beach. And they said, now, if you were a good pirate, would you careen your ship here? And I said, yeah, I think so. Looks great. They said, well, you might if you were a good pirate. But if you were a great pirate, would you do it here? And I looked around, and they said, let us show you what you can see and what can be seen from here if you careened here. They started to move me here and said, if you were a great pirate and the whole world was hunting for you, I don't think you'd go here. And they moved me to another location and another. And they kept talking about this great pirate. And the more they talked about him, the less I started to think about careening and strategy. And the more I watched these 2 guys talk about a man, not a ship, the Captain Joseph Bannister. So after several minutes, I could figure out that the Golden Fleece was not at this island. And I said to them, you didn't find it here, did you? They said, it wasn't here. History insisted it was here. Sensible people, smart people insisted it was here. But we could see after a time, after we searched, there was no pirate ship here. There were other ships. There were things, we found things like outboard engines, license plates, barbecue grills. No pirate ship. This was a 100-foot pirate ship, a beautiful sailing ship. Not there. They said, but where else to look? They said, take a look at this bay. And the bay went on 20, 25 miles deep. And it was huge. And they said, once we knew it wasn't at Cayo Levantado, we were in big trouble because now it could be anywhere in the bay. And we had no clue where to look. They said, now come with us. So they started their engine, and they took me about 5 or 6 miles back into the bay. And they said, they turned off the engine. And they said, let me tell you about Joseph Bannister. Because once we realized the wreck was not at Cayo Levantado, and that there was no hope of narrowing it down anymore according to history, we determined that if we had any hopes of finding this pirate ship at all, we had to go looking for the man instead of the ship. We had to find Bannister, not the Golden Fleece. And how could we possibly do that? John Matera said, let me try. John Matera was a man of history, and he started to tell me there a story of Joseph Bannister. He said that after they finished looking at Cayo Levantado, he went looking for this pirate captain, and here's what he found. We're sitting there on these gentle waves in the middle of paradise, and he tells me this story, not of a pirate captain, but of a merchant captain. Joseph Bannister began his career as a merchant captain, a well-respected, noble Englishman who was entrusted by wealthy ship owners to sail their ship, the Golden Fleece, between London and Port Royal, Jamaica. Port Royal at the time was known as the wickedest city on earth, full of brothels and taverns and pirates. Lots of lawbreakers and lots of people who made lots of money from lawbreakers. And for years, Joseph Bannister sailed as an honest man between London and Port Royal, delivering sugar and hides and indigo dyes and other cargo of the time. But then, in 1684, for reasons no one could determine and history never spoke of, Joseph Bannister stole his own ship, the Golden Fleece, recruited a top-flight pirate crew, and went on the account, as it was said, of piracy then. He went on a pirating rampage. His career as a pirate lasted nearly 6 weeks from that point. The governor of Jamaica, Governor Lynch, sent the Royal Navy warships after this new pirate Bannister, and he sent them with a vengeance. You could not do this kind of thing in Port Royal. You could not be an honest man and go rogue. He wasn't going to allow it. And he gave orders not just to get Bannister, but to make an example of him, which meant Bannister was going to hang. The Royal Navy captured him very quickly, brought him back to Port Royal, and had an ironclad case against him. In fact, they had 2 witnesses, 2 Spaniards who'd Bannister taken prisoner after he stole their ship. The Spaniards were ready to testify. The case was ironclad. But this was Port Royal. This was a town of pirates. And when the 2 Spaniards came to testify, they swore that Bannister had hired them to work on the Golden Fleece and that he was the most honest man in the Caribbean. That was very, very disturbing to Governor Lynch, but he still had this open and shut case. But when the jury came back with a verdict about the pirates and about Bannister, the verdict was not guilty. This was Port Royal. The verdict was so disturbing to Governor Lynch, he is said to have died of it a week later. A not guilty verdict killed him. But Bannister was not in the clear. Lynch's successor, Henry Molesworth, decided against law and procedure to hold Bannister and retry him again with no double jeopardy. So he let Bannister sit and rot in Port Royal. Somehow Bannister raised enough bail to remain free in Port Royal. But just to make sure he wasn't going anywhere, Molesworth had the sails of the Golden Fleece cut down. By this time, Bannister was worse than broke. Whatever money he'd used to secure his verdict and to get his bail, he was likely out completely. The bail was 20 times the average yearly wage of a seaman at the time. Nonetheless, a few months later, in the dead of night, after even the prostitutes and tavern keepers were sleeping, Joseph Bannister made his way through the crooked streets of Port Royal down to the wharf, where he jumped aboard the Golden Fleece and met a new pirate crew who had assembled. And that new pirate crew raised new sails that they had arranged. And the sails came up, they picked up a breeze, they cut the line, and drifted away. Now, if there was any such thing as a suicide mission in 1684, this was it. To escape into open water, Bannister and his men had to sail past the guns at Fort James and even more guns at Fort Charles. Fort Charles was one of the most heavily fortified places in the world at the time. There was no hope of escape, yet Bannister kept sailing. They made their way past Fort James. Nobody was expecting such a thing, but when they got to Fort Charles, the guns began to ring out. And they battered the Golden Fleece, and the Golden Fleece took damage, but Bannister had this first-rate crew with him, and they brought plugs and mattresses, and they patched the holes, and they managed to get out and disappear into the ether. And this time, Bannister and his men were not going to be so easy to find. In fact, for 2 years, Bannister went on a pirating rampage, hooking up with other legendary pirates and always staying one step ahead of Molesworth and the Royal Navy ships Molesworth kept sending after him. By 1686, Molesworth was writing in his letters and his logs that though he'd sent the Royal Navy ships to capture Bannister and to kill him, he believed the Navy was as likely to capture Bannister this time around as they had been the previous 2 years, meaning he had no hope of capturing Bannister at all. Bannister had turned himself into one of the great pirates of the Caribbean. But in 1686, Molesworth got a break. He got a tip that Bannister was on the Kurson in Samana Bay, and he sent 2 of his mighty warships, the Falcon and the Drake, to go pin Bannister down. If they could get there in time and get the Golden Fleece on the careen, they would have Bannister. And when they got there, the ship was on the careen, tipped over on its side, being cleaned by the pirates. Now, at the sight of one Royal Navy warship, any pirate would throw up his hands. It was over at that point. At the sight of two, absolutely no hope. But Bannister wasn't just careening his ship. Before he turned it over, he had had 2 cannon batteries taken from the ship and put high up on the island's hill where he had careened. The pirates weren't just careening. They were waiting for the Royal Navy. And when they caught sight of the Royal Navy warships, instead of throwing their hands up, Bannister ordered the bugler to sound the alarm, and the pirates rained down hell on the Navy warships. A battle ensued and lasted for 2 full days. Brutal exchange of cannons and musket fire, hand grenades, anything they could throw at each other. And at the end of the second day, the Royal Navy had suffered 23 dead and wounded, were out of powder and shot, and retreated back to Port Royal. It was an unthinkable victory for Bannister and the pirates, unknown before or since in that kind of way. The pirate captains of the Falcon and Drake knew that they could be executed for that kind of a loss, that kind of a humiliation when they returned to Port Royal. But Molesworth must have known with whom he was dealing in Bannister. He censured the pirates. He did not execute them. They refitted the Falcon and Drake and sent them back to Samana Bay to capture Bannister, but as usual, Bannister had disappeared. So I'm listening to this story. It sounds like an incredible pirate story, but more than anything, I'm watching the men talk about Joseph Bannister, and they said we had to learn Bannister's story. Even more than that, we had to get into his mind, we had to get into his heart in order to have any clue where to look next. I said, so what happened? Where did you look? They didn't say anything. They just started the engine on the boat and took me further back into the bay. About 10 or 15 minutes later, and this still seems so strange to me when I think about it, we pulled into a smaller island. But the funny thing about this island was you couldn't see it coming. In fact, the island didn't appear to exist until you were right on top of it. It was a very strange thing, but when you pulled around onto it and pulled into a little cove there, they said, what do you see from here? And you could turn around and you could see the entire bay, but you couldn't see it coming in. They said, this is where a great pirate might go. They pulled over and they docked the boat, and there were a couple crewmen there waiting with metal detectors. You know, the kind you run along the beach looking for a lost wedding ring, that kind of thing. But these were heavy duty. These were the real thing, with headphones and everything. And they said, come hike with us up this island. And I looked at the island. It's very high. It's 80 or 100 feet high, and there was no path. They said, you have to go through the woods, basically. And so we climbed. I think I was even sweatier then than I am now, if you can believe that. And it was true. They told me there's a different kind of sweat in the Dominican Republic, and it was really true. And there were bird-sized insects dive bombing. It was a tough climb. And we had all this gear, and we got to the top of the island, or close to the top. And they said, let's dig here. And they started to run the metal detectors on the top of the hill. And for a while, nothing happened. But then some beeps, some chirps started coming. Beep, beep. And the chirps got faster and louder. And then they became almost crazy. They were screaming. They said, let's dig here. The guys got out some hatchets and some shovels, some scoopers, and said, let's do it here. We got down on our knees and we started digging and digging. And before long, we hit into the ground. And instead of the mud thudding, we hit clank, a metal sound. And they said, that's it, get it. And they were telling me, get it. I didn't know what I was getting or what we were doing, but the sound of that and the machine screaming was so exciting. So we dug and dug, and there was something in there. And I got more mud off and more, and I could see something emerge, something as round as the top of the moon. And they said, get that, that's yours. And I dug under it and finally got my hand under, and I pulled it out, a perfect 6-pound cannonball. It was a perfect sphere. And they said to me, no one has seen that or touched that since 1686. The Royal Navy fired that at Bannister and his men, and now you're the one to pick it up. And the thrill was beyond anything I could describe to you, even better than treasure. This was real history. This was battle, a pirate battle. And they said, that cannonball is yours. They said, now let's go to the top. There was only a little bit more to climb to the top of the island. And when we got up there, and it's all covered by brush and thick woods, they said, look out there. And when I looked out through a little clearing in the brush, I understood everything about the rest of the story. From that vantage point, I could see all of Samana Bay, every bit of it. In fact, from that vantage point, it felt like I could see all the world. But nobody would have had a hope of seeing me in return. But even if they had, they could have fired at me all day long for day one, and all day long for day two. They could have fired at me for years until they ran out of powder and shot. They never could have hurt me. If I would have been behind this brush and behind the mud and dug in, they could have fired all day long, and I would have won the battle by myself. I could have beat the Royal Navy from there. And I knew that this is where a great pirate would have come if only you could get into his mind. And that really is the start of Pirate Hunters and the start of the story of my new book. So I thank all of you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. I should say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say plenty of time for questions and comments from the audience now.
Yes, and I should say before questions that I feel very lucky to have a member of the crew who worked on finding the Golden Fleece. Howard Ehrenberg is here. And also one of the great treasure hunters in the history of the world, Carl Fismer, is here too. Fizz is a legend, a real legend.
I appreciate you keeping the history alive. I mean, you nailed it. I couldn't add something that you forgot.
Oh, well, you should see the coin on Fizz's.
That's from the Record of the Conception, 1641, which when Matera and Chatterton came down, we had many visits. I'm sorry these guys aren't here. You'd really have to meet them, but you will in the book. In fact, thank you for putting me in there too, and thanks for the kind words. But I worked some in Al Bay, and I worked at the Dominican Republic long before these guys ever got there. But what did I know? They came in, and scientifically they nailed everything. I'm one of the old-timey guys, and John Chatterton was a guest on my TV show, and he said, I'm going to bring you into the 19th century. Okay, that's it. Thanks, Robert. You nailed it.
It's an honor. So if you ever had a question for a real treasure hunter, a true one, and one of the good guys, you should ask Fizz. It's a rare opportunity. So with that, if anybody has any questions for me or for Howard, who would work this whole thing, or for Fizz, let's do it. Yes, sir.
Did they ever determine why Bannister went rogue?
That's one of the great questions. Why did Bannister go rogue? And Bannister was so interesting because Bannister apparently, when he did this, was at a point very similar to Chatterton and Matera in his life. He was headed for his own soft landing. He could have seen his days out as a merchant captain. He had obviously worked many years to get to this point. You didn't just become a captain in charge of such a great ship and so responsible for so much. Had he seen his days out as a captain, he could have retired with a nice house by the sea and a dog by his side, and could have watched the ocean and the waves through his final days. But he didn't do that. Instead, he took one of the biggest risks a person could have taken in the late 1600s. He was going to hang for sure if he was caught. And according to history, he did. They finally caught up with Bannister. But history doesn't say at all why he did this. It was left to Chatterton and Matera to try to figure it out. And one of the things that they came up with, and one of the things they theorized about, and it was just a theory, but it came after a good, long, hard look into Bannister's life, was that pirate ships were among the first democracies there were. Everything on a pirate ship was voted on. And this was a concept, democracy, that wouldn't take hold in the United States for another 100 years. The lowliest man on a pirate ship, the lowliest deckhand, his vote counted equal to the captain's vote. And they voted on everything: where to go, what to steal, who to take prisoner. If they didn't like the captain, they could vote to throw him out or maroon him and steal his ship, even if the ship belonged to the captain. the captain got not a frog's leg more to eat than the lowliest guy on board. And the more they read about this concept of democracy, this thrilling experiment that was going on pirate ships, the more they started to wonder if Bannister hadn't been driven by the thrill of the idea of being completely free and free among men and being in charge of a crew like that. And it was that idea that this guy may have done this with a statement in mind or to make history in a certain way that started to change their focus. But we'll never know for sure. They're all just theories.
Is it possible that he just got caught up in the culture, having visiting Port Royal all the time and being among bad people, and he just...
That's very possible. That's very possible that Bannister might have got caught up in the thrill of Port Royal and the excitement of it. We'll never know, but we do know that for years he came there and stayed straight. So I think it was unexpected by the governor there and unexpected by at least several of the townsfolk. But certainly possible that he may have got swept up in it. And, you know, a pirate stood, if he had a good day, to make more in a day than even a merchant captain might make in a very long time. So that's possible. Yes?
You know, I thought it was going to be, your talk was fantastic. And I was thinking to myself, oh, man, that's the whole book. Now, it's not, clearly. What is, without giving away a spoiler alert, the basic framework in just a few words of what your book is actually going to be taking and talking about?
Well, thank you for that question. The question is, what is the book about? I didn't tell you the whole book. I think I'm not giving away too much to say that if I wrote a book called Pirate Hunters about the search for a pirate ship, I wouldn't end it with them not finding the pirate ship. So I think readers would be very angry about that. But the real great mystery, and one of the really vexing things about this, was that even if Chatterton and Matera found the Golden Fleece, to them, proving it was the Golden Fleece, proving its identity was everything. And for any of you who might have read Shadow Divers, you'll remember that Chatterton found a World War II German U-boat that was not supposed to be there. Nobody in the world knew it was there. He found it on day one. He spent 6 years of his life, risking his life, seeing friends die, losing all his money, losing his marriage, and coming very close to dying himself several times in order to put a name on that U-boat. The name was everything. And for the U-boat, it was just a 3-digit number, a footnote to history, but Chatterton was willing to die to be certain. I mean, early on in the game, he had a good idea which U-boat it was. He was pretty sure which U-boat it was, but those words are worse than death to him. He did not want to be pretty sure. He wanted to be absolutely sure for history and for himself. And so he got himself into a very tricky situation with this pirate ship, because unlike a U-boat, which is likely to have identification somewhere inside, a pirate ship is almost certain not to. Pirate ships were stealth operations. They were meant to be invisible. They officially didn't exist. That was the idea. They filed no crew lists, no manifests, no plans with any government or navy. So when they went missing, nobody went looking for them. And even if you survived the sinking of a pirate ship, it would be very hard to describe in those days in the 1600s where it had happened. But even still, let's say you were an explorer, a diver, or even a beachcomber, a weekend swimmer, and you stumbled across a shipwreck that looked to be from the 1600s, the golden age of piracy, and you dared to think this was a pirate ship. How would you ever prove it? It's going to have the same cannons, the same weapons, the same silverware and dishes. It'd be very, very difficult. So these guys put themselves into a very tricky situation, and some of the book is about how they went about proving that this was the Golden Fleece and about learning to think like Bannister in order to get to the spot. Yes?
Was it difficult to enlist the cooperation of the Dominican authorities in this?
The question is, was it difficult to enlist the cooperation of the Dominican authorities? At the time, this occurred in 2008, 2009, the Dominican Republic was one of the few countries left that allowed private treasure hunters, private salvors to work. And at the time, their agreement was that they would lease a certain portion of the waters, Dominican waters, to private treasure hunters in return for 50% of everything that was pulled off a ship. And sometimes they would allow the treasure hunter to make the piles themselves, and then the government would pick which pile. So you better do it right. No heavy piles on one side. But according to the lease, it was all good as long as you split it with the government. My understanding now, and Fizz can correct me if I'm wrong about this, I don't believe they've issued any new leases. Nobody's working in the Dominican Republic anymore. And part of the book, going back to your question, was the time pressure that the Chatterton and Matera were under. They knew even then that time was ticking on treasure hunters, that countries were signing on to a UNESCO agreement, and there was pressure being brought by academics and archaeologists against private salvage. So they had to do this fast. And they were right about that. There's no longer any private salvage going on in the Dominican Republic. That's it. So they did it in the nick of time. Yes?
Did they just find where it belongs to ships, or they think they did it off the coast of Haiti and Dominican Republic are on the same island? So how do they decide who it belongs to? I guess maybe it's not a relevant question, but
Well, it's a very good question. How do they decide who this belongs to? And you know, every so often, and it's almost like clockwork, you'll hear word of a discovery of a historic shipwreck. And I'm not an expert in any particular of these discoveries, except to say that often enough, the claims will not turn out to be as certain as the finder has announced them to be. So I don't know about the one you're speaking of, but if it's found in Haitian waters, then it may belong to Haiti. But part of signing on to these UNESCO agreements is an agreement that a shipwreck might belong to the country of origin. So that's trouble for private treasure hunters. They have to work where the government says, if you find it here, you can keep half of it at least.
Unless it's a pirate ship.
Unless it's a pirate ship.
did you guys keep your cannonball?
My cannonball is still in the Dominican Republic, but it has my name on it.
Where is it?
And it's they're in the Ministry of Culture. And cannonballs turn out to be quite common. Is that correct, Howard?
Well, like in general?
Yes, in general.
Well, I mean, on that particular wreck, we found a lot of cannonballs because so many cannonballs have been fired between both parties. So there were actually cannonballs all over the bay because they were kind of shooting all over the place. But in the water, and I mean, ultimately, the ones on land that we found also. So, does that answer that?
But is it there because you couldn't take it, or
We
chose to leave it?
we're not allowed to leave. With the agreement with the Dominican Republic government that we had, and we were actually working under Tracy Bowden's lease. So Tracy Bowden had the lease. We were working as, you know, a subcontractor of Tracy Bowden. Anything that anytime we were conducting salvage operation, we had a naval officer on the boat. So anytime we came up out of the water and emptied our pockets, they inventoried everything, and everything immediately went to the lab, the subaquatico, the Cultura department, and then ultimately after preservation, then there would be the split. So things would be in preservation and conservation for at least a year or two before any of the treasure was split up between the government and the contractor.
Is the Dominican Republic a party to the International Convention on Salvage?
Excuse me?
The International Convention on Salvage. Do you know if the Dominican Republic is a party to it?
I don't. The question was, is the Dominican Republic party to the International Convention on Salvage? And I do not know.
Because that would trump any Dominican law.
Don't know.
Don't know.
Into that.
Don't know.
Don't know. Go ahead.
Treasure that the Dominican Republic has, where is it now held?
The treasure the Dominican Republic has is held. It's in Santo Domingo. It's
Right.
it's
Is
in
it
the.
a museum?
It's
or-
not in a museum. It's in the conservation lab, and some things they put in a museum eventually, but within the lab itself, they have, you know, from all the people that have been working there, all the projects, they have all kinds of conservation efforts going on to preserve the artifacts and try and get. It was when we pick, and I think there's some pictures. There are some pictures in the book of. It says it's a knife, and you look at it, and like fizzles. It's like it looks like a crusty rock, and over time they will get all of the encrustation off of it, and you can see what's underneath. And that just you have to do that very slowly. It can take, and they don't have the best technology down there.
But it's still in laboratory and
Yes.
they're working on it.
Yeah,
So
some of these things are
someday it'll end up in a
someday some of these things will probably end up in a museum.
Yeah.
Yeah, what kind of depth was she in and how far offshore?
What kind of depth was she in? Was the question, and how far offshore?
Was that-
Probably about 50 yards offshore.
Not even.
Not even. And actually, the depth was, according to
Right. One of the
according to Phipps.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things was Fizz has worked on a real classic wreck called Concepcion, which is also on the north coast of the Dominican Republic. Concepcion was a very famous wreck even back in the mid-1600s when she sank. And an explorer, for 40 years, people went looking for Concepcion, couldn't find it. It had a massive amount of silver on it. But an explorer named William Phipps from, I think it was from Maine originally, petitioned the King of England.
From England, right? He became the
He
governor.
became the first governor of Massachusetts. But he petitioned the King of England and got investment to go looking for the Concepcion. On his way, he anchored in Samana Bay while he's going to look for Concepcion. No one's been able to find Concepcion for about 45 years. But he's on his way, and he thinks he can find it. But he anchors in Samana Bay about 6 months after the pirates did battle with the Royal Navy. And his men see the wreck of the Golden Fleece, and they describe it. It's sunk in 24 feet of water. It has muskets on its deck.
Firelocks laying on the deck.
Firelocks laying on the deck. It has cannonballs on top of it marked with the symbol of the broad arrow, symbol of the Royal Navy. So there's a very good eyewitness description just months after the sinking by a treasure hunter who days later finds Concepcion and becomes incredibly rich.
And we took that to heart as we were searching. The depth, often we'd be diving somewhere and say, it's kind of deep, but we had to look anyway. And at the end of the day, it really was at about 24 feet.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned how hard it is to positively identify a pirate ship, and would Blackbeard's ship be an example?
Yes, Blackbeard's ship, Queen Anne's Revenge, is thought to have been found in North Carolina. And there's very good evidence that it is Queen Anne's Revenge, but there's some evidence that it might not be. And that's the problem with pirate ships. It's very tough to prove conclusively. At the time I wrote Pirate Hunters, there was some serious doubt about whether they had found it, and I quoted some archaeologists in the book expressing their doubt about that ship. I don't know if they'll ever know for sure about Queen Anne's Revenge. There's also some pretty good argument to be made that one of Captain Kidd's ships, the Queda Merchant, was found in the Dominican Republic. But again, like the Queen Anne's Revenge, there's some doubt, and nobody could say for sure. And that was, as I said before, a real problem for Chatterton and Matera even going into this thing, that even if they found the wreck, how are they going to prove it? And yet they do prove it conclusively, and the way they do it, which I will not give away, is almost miraculous. It was the confluence of circumstances and discoveries all came together at just the right moment in the unlikeliest of ways. There's no bell on the ship. It's something even better. So I leave it at that.
I think this is for Fizz. What do you think of Mel Fisher?
Want to come up here, Fizz?
Yeah, sure. I worked with Mel for 12 years. I made Mel a lot of money. We had a good division. And if it hadn't have been for Mel Fisher doing what he did, we'd already be out of business today. I know there's a lot of bad stories going around about him, but Mel never stuck it to anybody that didn't try to stick it to him first. The first impression you got was, it's some old country bumpkin. Yeah, I'm going to come out of this on top. Not true. Mel was in federal court 113 times. He won 112 straight. The last time I talked to him before he passed, he told me, he said, Fizz, it's cost me $7 million to defend my legal, lawful rights. And he was right. The first court you go into is state court. I don't care if you're a treasure hunter, you lose in state court. If God came down out of heaven and swore you were, they wouldn't believe it. You lose in state court. Your next step is a federal court, and then the Supreme Court. And that's where Mel had to go, 113 times. Won 112 straight. The 113th, he lost. I swear to you, that was a conspiracy. I have my attorneys up in Atlanta, and I called him up, and I said, Dick, this looks like a conspiracy to me. He said, don't say that word. That's not nice in legal terms. And I said, what would you call it? He said, conspiracy. So Mel it wasn't for him, I wouldn't be working today. So that's what I think about Mel Fisher. Thanks for the question.
Fizz is one of the great storytellers I've ever met in my life. And the adventure of just learning the world of treasure hunting and private salvage was such a thrill for me. And if anybody ever can have a conversation with Fizz, you'll always be better off for it. He is, in the business of storytelling, to listen to him tell a story is awesome.
Some of them are true.
I wonder how many treasures are found and no one hears it on the news.
Yeah, that's a good point. Someone, I can't remember who it was, said to me that especially these days, if you find a treasure, it may not be a great idea to announce it, at least up front. And that.
Then the question to that is, if you find treasure that has no provenance, then what's it worth? Right. It's worth something to you.
Yeah, it's weight in gold. That's right.
It's worth its weight in gold. That's about it.
That's right. Yes.
I was going to add something maybe interesting. I recently saw Carl Fissmer and met him in Key Largo.
Yeah, I thought I recognized you.
Yeah, I work for Divers Direct, and he spoke at our Key Largo store.
I'm meeting your boss tomorrow for lunch, by the way. We're going to do all your stores.
Awesome. I'm glad. I'm at the one in Fort Lauderdale, but I want to say it's a small world. You recently became my friend on Facebook, and you posted a question about baseball and why do pitchers look up.
Yes, I do. Oh, that's good. Thank you.
And Carl became my friend recently, but I just want to point out, I started diving not too long ago, 2 years ago, and I learned at a place called American Dive Center in Coral Springs. The owner of the shop, who's become my friend, is a guy named Ed Murphy. Name sound familiar to you?
Yes, it does. But I can't place it. Remind me.
Well, he was the one that owned this shop up, was it New Jersey, where Richie Kohler, who hadn't dove in a while, came in and saw the ads for the weekend charters, and he got him into the deep water wreck diving.
Yes, that's good. Yeah. One of the things I love about these stories is that these adventures seem accessible and available to the average person. When I wrote about shadow divers, John and Richie, the two main characters, were working full-time day jobs. And then on the weekends, we're having adventures and making history in ways that navies and governments and experts and historians couldn't touch. They were doing groundbreaking things and rewriting the history books kind of in their spare time. And I love that. The idea that you could be an average person and go out and do something great.
James Cameron and his sub, supposedly the one that went to the Marianas Trench, and he declared that he has a sub more advanced than anything the Navy has, the U.S. Navy. There's no U.S. Navy sub can go down there. Well, maybe not. But you mentioned the average man. So
yes. Yeah, that's right. And there are good arguments to be made about, for and against private treasure hunting. But I think there's one point you can't argue with, and that is that if private treasure hunters don't work, there are going to remain ships that never get found, because it's very expensive to go looking for ships. And you have to raise a lot of money often to do it. And sometimes private treasure hunters, the guy who's really looking to make the score, is the only guy who's able to do that, to raise the money and take those kinds of risks.
I'd like to see a law where, and maybe Mr. Prisma would agree, is if let's say you're diving in a certain area of the ocean looking for a treasure, if there's no other boats actively searching, then you should have and you find a treasure there, then you should be able to say to Spain, well, you were not actively searching. If this meant so much to you, why weren't you here looking for it?
He's talking about admiralty law.
Yeah.
There's
a lot to say about that.
Too much to say about that right
admiralty
now.
law.
Oh, that's big.
The old law of the sea. In other words, let's just say you had a ship and it sank and you said, oh my goodness, it's a lot of money, and you look for it and you look for it and you look for it a long time. As long as you're looking for it, that's yours. But when you say, I give up, I quit, I'm abandoning it. Admiralty law, lost or abandoned property. Well, they did away with it, and when you leave, that means, hey, I can go looking for it, and if I find it, it's mine. Yes, sir. I'm not trying to hog your show.
No, I love it.
If property belongs to a sovereign, they have to expressly abandon it.
Absolutely.
Right.
I mean,
That was the problem with the with Odyssey and the recent
I happen to know
litigation
that
with
Greg
Spain.
Sim and I are friends.
Does Germany
He's been
own the
offering
U-boat?
me jobs for 2 years.
We talked together. We've never
They do
met.
because
I
it's a
know who you
war
are.
grave.
Oh, wait, what does that mean?
But if it was privately owned, there does not have to be an express articulation of abandonment, and then the law kicks in, as well as the law of salvage.
Because the
Yeah,
guy with
well-
the richest lawyers went out
You gonna be at work tomorrow? I'll be there about noon.
to Fort Lauderdale.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll be there.
okay. I talked to, what's her name?
I'll,
Your boss.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
All right. Yeah, it's Admiralty law was specific: lost or abandoned property. You can look for it. When you quit, you quit. That means I can go looking for it. Maybe I'll find it. Maybe I
But now
won't.
it belongs to the sovereign, though. The sovereign has to expressly abandon it. That means you have to articulate it as a matter of a legal instrument.
Like Spain has no claim over a ship that sunk 300 years ago.
That's right. They
Yeah,
don't
not
because they gave up on it. But now today, because I'm not going to start naming politicians, but some of our politicians have said no, Spain gets it anyway, which is why they stole Odyssey's coins and gave them to the King of Spain. And by the way, the King of Spain said, my goodness, I've been giving away billions of dollars worth of information for years, which he has. A man named Jack Haskins was the best researcher in the world. I'm not kidding about this. I worked with Jack for 32 years. It's the only reason I know what I know about this business. Jack's passed on. I inherited 250,000 pages of archival research from Seville, Spain. Well, now that the King of Spain realized when he got all those coins from Odyssey, he was giving away literally billions of dollars worth of information, he closed it. Nobody's going there now, no treasure hunters. So if anybody here needs some archival research, I'm about the only game in town. I've had over 500 calls on it. We've worked 2 of the wrecks that I've got, and we've hit it big on both of them. But
I wanted to ask you a question.
Sure.
Around Seminole Bay, did you find any like trees with markings on them that you might think that might be related to piracy?
Well, that's a good question. I'll let Howard.
I mean, that was like that was over 300 years ago, almost 400 years ago. I mean,
Because you were looking on land, weren't you?
well, we at one point, I don't want to give away the story in the book, but at a certain point, the search went onto the land.
Right.
But we were primarily water-based for our searches.
Right. I mean, if they were careening the ship on shore, right? As I
Mhm.
understand,
Yes.
they would offload cargo.
Well,
All speculation.
yeah. I mean, you know. Can you tell me about the pirate base?
You don't have to.
I wouldn't
you don't
have
have to,
ruined-
to disclose anything. I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, suffice it to say that the pirates probably did spend time on the island. There was, the rest of that area was virtually uninhabited at that time, though. It was, so, you know, whatever they were doing there, they were probably just like, you know, having bonfires and roasting marshmallows or whatever.
Mr. Kurson, have you thought of your next book? Already have a list of
I'm always on the hunt for a great adventure.
Bermuda Triangle?
Oh, Bermuda Triangle. I used to have books on that when I was a kid.
We're trying to put the John Chatterton trilogy together.
Yeah.
You're in the Bermuda Triangle right now.
Is that count? Does this count?
This is one of the points of...
I knew I felt strange tonight somehow. So. And any other questions?
Privateers, can you just mention them?
Yes, privateers. You know, I knew very little about pirates, but privateers, and I think you probably all heard the term, were commissioned pirates. They were sanctioned by the state and hired to go hunt down enemy or hostile cargo ships. So there were a lot of pirates who kind of were working legally at the time. Bannister was not one of them. He was a regular true blue pirate, out for his own personal gain and profit, and at great risk. So he had no commission.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, folks, so if there are no more questions, a quick reminder for our internet audience watching at home. There's still time to call the number on your screen, and we could ship Pirate Hunters to wherever you are in the U.S. free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have Pirate Hunters as well as Mr. Kurson's previous books, Crashing Through and Shadow Divers. They're for sale at the counter in the front room over there. He's going to be signing over here at the table to the left of the podium. I want to thank Howard for joining in to Q&A. And yes. And this has been fascinating. Please give Robert Kurson another hand. Thanks very much.